and welcome to the Farmers Supply Association Agri Report. I'm Randy Klepechka, agronomist with Farmers Supply Association. Well, we've about got this thing wrapped up. I know there's still a few beans being cut, but a lot of people are done. I think most people are done, and we've about got this thing wrapped up. So, that's good news. We had a pretty good crop this year. Always there's something issues. It's never perfect, but had a pretty good crop with pretty good prices. So we're ready to get into that off season. And this off season is going to be a little bit different because of what we got staring us in the face for 2022. Right now, the big news, around a lot of the country, and especially in farm country, is inflation, and that means higher prices, higher input prices for our farmers. The big thing or the first thing that has really, shown its face has been fertilizer prices. A lot of other stuff will probably come, but we won't know a lot of those prices till closer to crop season. But we know where the fertilizer prices are at right now, and they're high. So that's what a lot of farmers are talking about right now. A lot of people are already start talking about where do we cut. I hate to start talking about that, but I know that you can only spend so much money. One of our clients, a guy that I've worked with back since my extension days, now he's a customer of Farmers Supply Association. One of his lines, and I've always used it with some other people I know, and one of his best lines is "spend yourself broke." So you can only spend so much. I mean, even though most of those inputs you're spending on are very beneficial and a lot of times pretty needed, you can only spend so much money. So with some of these higher prices, vast majority of people are going to be looking for some places to cut. Hopefully, you will be selective in making those cuts. I hate hearing those statements, and I've heard some of them already. We're just going to cut, a certain thing just totally out. We're going to cut potash out, this and that out totally. Well, I don't like seeing that. There's places you can cut stuff more than others. So let's be careful and try to be selective in those cuts. Try to go item by item down your budget. Some places you can make cuts, and some places if you make cuts, you're going to hurt yourself pretty bad. In the end, we still got to make a crop. You still got to make a crop to pay those loans off. So I think it's very important we be selective in making those cuts. Again, that we go item by item down that budget. One thing certainly looking for is more than likely more soybeans, less rice. Soybeans have less input costs, about half the cost of rice or less, and of course we don't have the urea, the nitrogen in there for a soybean, so that's one of the big things. But certainly look for more soybeans and less rice this year. What I want to do for the rest of the program is just go item by item. We're going to talk about fertilizer because that's the main thing. In some later programs, I'll probably try to touch on some of the other input costs and maybe look at them and see where you might be able to make some cuts and where you don't want to make any cuts. But looking at the different fertilizer elements, we'll start with the macronutrients. We'll start with nitrogen. Of course, with nitrogen, we're talking about rice, corn, grain sorghum, and wheat with those higher nitrogen, with those nitrogen needs that we got to take care of. You look at the University of Arkansas, that's where we get our base recommendations for nitrogen for most of these crops. If you're growing those crops in our area, those recommendations are kind of averages. They're a good starting point. I know a lot of people, especially with rice and some corn as well, are putting more than what the university recommends out there. Sometimes they're getting good benefit from that. Sometimes they may not be. So if you're one that generally or almost always goes higher than those university recommended rates, be sure you're getting that benefit of that extra nitrogen out there. If you're not, that could be a place you could make a little cut there. So again, I think in most cases you want to stay at least with those recommended rates unless you know that you can get by with less. That's the first place to look right there, is if you're going more than those recommended rates and you don't know that you're getting that extra benefit, then may look at cutting there. There are some tools, and these are not used very much because they're difficult and a lot of times to do, but the Instar program, the deep soil test that we use for some of these crops, especially rice, not used that much because it's difficult to get that soil sample. Green Seeker, can determine whether you need mid-season nitrogen or not on our rice varieties. Again, not used a lot because you've got to do that prep and putting that extra nitrogen spot out, before when you put your pre-flood out, so you'll have a reference point out there. So that's not used very much, if any. One thing that's been developed in corn, it's kind of used a little bit, is the lower stalk test, and this is something that you do at the end of at harvest, after harvest, for the next crop, during that time period, to see how efficient you were with your nitrogen in your corn. So, that's if you haven't done that, then that's not going to be good for next year. But maybe something you think about in the future. And that's where you take the lower stalk and cut that out and send that off, and that'll tell you how much nitrogen is left in that stalk, and that'll tell you whether you're over fertilizing with nitrogen or not. So again, these are things you may consider with the higher nitrogen costs. And if you've got any questions on these, contact me or your county agent, and we'd be glad to help you on that. Next element is phosphorus. Phosphorus is one place that you can probably make some cuts a lot of time if you're regularly putting phosphorus out there, especially with rice and soybeans. A lot of times, even if our soil test calls for phosphorus, the research tests and plots have shown that a lot of times there's not much, if any, response to phosphorus, even on some of these soils that call for it. So, unless you got some very low testing phosphorus, high pH ground, or you've gotten positive responses from phosphorus that are economical, that might be a place you can make some cuts. So again, look at those phosphorus levels in your soil. Hopefully you've got soil tests to look at for all of this. But phosphorus might be one of your prime places that you can make some cuts when you're looking to make cuts. So just be careful with that. Again, I think the biggest needs would be with corn and wheat, rice and soybeans, less needs, so you can kind of analyze that a little bit on your farm. Potash. This is one place that I think we get, besides nitrogen, probably the biggest bang for your buck out there. So potash, it's really good to have a soil sample. I see fields, especially some of the heavy soils have been well fertilized that don't call for any potash, and that's fine, because I think that's true. I think you can get by without any potash on those soils. So it's really good to have a soil test to look at those potash levels and just base everything on that. But again, I hate just I've heard some people saying they're going to cut potash or phosphorus completely out. I don't want to cut that potash out unless I know that I can get by with that. If I got high potash levels in the soil, you're fine, obviously, but don't just go making those general blanket statements. I think 'cause potash is where you can really get some good return on that money that you spend. So then moving to some of our micronutrients and secondary nutrients. Boron, and the big thing with boron is with soybeans. Most of the research in Arkansas has not shown response to other crops pretty much other than soybeans, and that's primarily on some of these high pH silt loam rice soils. Cross County, right in our footprint, Cross County, Poinsett County, Eastern Jackson, but I've found boron deficiency in the Swifton area, Tuckerman area as well over the past several years. So be careful with boron needs, and again, you don't have to put it on all crops. Again, these soybeans, especially this irrigated ground, flood irrigated ground with high pHs, and again in Cross County, Jackson County, Poinsett County is the primary for this. So where it needs boron, it really needs it, but again, on other crops, maybe other types of soil, you don't need that boron. A great way to get boron, if you're a Farmer Supply customer, is through the Aspire product, which has potash and boron in the same prill. It's got a half a unit of boron and I think 58 units of potash. So that's a great source, been university proven, and it's a great way to get that boron and potash both out there if you have those needs. Another micronutrient is zinc, and we've kind of been primary for zinc needs. That's mainly rice and corn. Again, other crops really don't have needs for zinc, so if you're putting it in other crops, you probably don't need it there. But for zinc, for rice and corn, you may need that zinc. Again, if you have high pHs over 6.5 and low levels of zinc. Now, I've been kind of almost amazed at some of the zinc levels I see, especially in Poinsett County, where these guys have been putting granular zinc, the zinc sulfate pre-plant pretty regularly over there. And you'll look at their soil samples and results, and they'll have zinc levels over 10 out there, and that's pretty high. And that's well above where we would recommend zinc, or the university recommends zinc, and I've not recommended zinc on a lot of those fields, and we never see any issues with it. So again, where they've been putting those high levels of zinc sulfate, the granular zinc, and you know that your levels are high, and I think a lot of times in that area you're going to see high levels of zinc and you can get by without it. So it doesn't have to be an automatic case in these areas, but certainly it seems like you get into Jackson County and we haven't been doing that as much, and a lot of times we're usually going to need the zinc on those high pH, low zinc soils over here. So again, a soil sample is a great base for these, but if you need it, you really need it, because it'll show up in corn and rice. So let's be careful with our zinc and know where we're at before you start making any cuts there. But the cuts can be made, again, especially in those areas where they've been putting a lot of zinc in the past. Finally, sulfur. I think sulfur is probably, it might be overused in some cases. We really need it in wheat, in wheat on our sandy soils. We need it on corn, especially on those sandy soils. So let's not cut the sulfur on those kind of situations. Again, the wheat and the corn on the sandy soil, so don't forego that sulfur on those crops. On some other crops where we're putting sulfur, we might get by without it. So again, just looking at all the different nutrients, the elements out there, and again, let's be selective. Let's go item by item down your budget and see where you can make cuts without losing a lot of yield, and then go from there. And I'd be glad to sit down with anybody who may want to look at especially their fertility needs or any other need agronomically, and see where you might be able to make those cuts. Because again, if we're going to make some cuts, we want to make sure they don't hurt us, because in the end we still got to make a crop. So for more information, you can contact me through Farmer Supply Association. And this has been Randy Klepetska with your November edition of the Farmer Supply Association Agri Report.